Hello again. When Michael Gove talked the other day of creating a new definition of extremism, he found himself in a very tricky position. The government needs a new definition so that they can crack down hard on some of the crazed religious fanatics whom we have been seeing every week on the streets of London over the last few months. The trouble is, if you start denouncing dangerous Islamists and suggest that the government should not be dealing with them or handing them money to fund their dubious activities, then before you know where you are, somebody's sure to accuse you of being Islamophobic. Nobody wants that kind of suggestion being bandied about, and so a very neat scheme has been hatched to counter that particular gambit. When you warn about the threat from Islamist hate groups, you say, and of course, groups on the far right as well, you join them together. We're cracking down on extremism, Islamist groups, and also the far right. Here's a simply marvellous example of this. Here's a newspaper report from last week in which Gove was about to name some Islamist groups. He was going to announce them in Parliament with parliamentary privilege and brand them extremist. So I wonder if we can all read what's written here. Let me read out what it says. Civil service will be ordered to cut funding and links to Islamist and far-right groups. Okay, does anybody seriously imagine that the British government or civil service are funding any far-right groups? Do you think that the civil service have any links with far-right groups? Of course not. That's obviously nuts. Do the government and civil service, though, fund Islamist groups and have links with them? They certainly do. This is where this mad idea of being even-handed gets us. The silly notion that the government is funding far-right groups is actually appearing in newspapers, and nobody at all appears to be saying just how ridiculous it is. This is where the fear of being thought to be Islamophobic can lead us, you see. Islamists can pose a real danger in this country, and Islamist groups and lone wolf attacks have killed almost 100 civilians in terrorist attacks over the last 20 years or so in this country. It makes sense to set a watch on them and for the government not to hand out a load of taxpayers' money to dodgy organisations which are anti-Semitic and opposed to this country's interests. When our armed forces are engaged in fighting Yemeni forces to keep the Red Sea open for shipping, we clearly don't want people in London chanting, "Yemen, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around." It'd be a bit mad to subsidise groups of people like that, wouldn't it, with our taxpayers' money? Of course, there are far-right groups, but they're not opposing British interests, and nor are they blowing themselves up and killing people. So really, they're not the problem, are they? The whole far-right business has simply been conjured up out of thin air so that the government can appear to be even-handed and fair. What all this means in practice is that instead of focusing all its efforts on the people who are liable to be a danger to us, the government's going to waste its time pretending that there's an equal threat from the so-called far right. I need hardly say that I'm talking here specifically about Islamists, not Muslims. By this I mean those people who wish to have religious and political power inextricably linked together so that both are governed entirely by the Quran and the Hadith. I think this is a terrible idea, and one which should be opposed wherever it's seen. I have, however, seen nothing even remotely comparable in right-wing groups in this country.